act like a fool around me.
What's happening on there?
What the fuck is going on?
The film opens with news reports highlighting a significant rise in crime throughout New York City. We are then introduced to Paul Kersey, who is now residing in Los Angeles. He bids farewell to his housekeeper, Rosario, before heading out to meet his girlfriend, Jerry Nichols, who is a news reporter. The couple visits Carol, who remains in a mental institution following the events of the previous film. They take Carol for a stroll around town, during which Paul steps away to buy ice cream and encounters a group of thugs who begin to take an interest in him. As Paul walks past them, he is bumped into and realizes that his wallet has been stolen. He pursues the assailants and manages to corner one of them, named Jiver, in an alley. Jiver admits that he does not have the wallet, prompting Paul to let him go. He returns to Jerry and Carol, telling them he may have left his wallet at home. They proceed to the pier, where Jerry departs for an interview with a senator. Meanwhile, the other gang members have traced Paul's address from his ID and arrive outside in a van. Unaware of the impending danger, Rosario is busy preparing dinner. One of the men grabs a crowbar while another rings the doorbell, pretending to deliver something for Paul. Although Rosario is initially skeptical and questions him, the others force their way in through the back door and subdue her as she screams for help. Seizing the moment, they decide to assault her and gag her to stifle her cries. One man, seemingly just released from prison, begins to assault her while the others encourage him. After he finishes, they drag her to the bedroom, taking turns with her. A short while later, Paul and Carol return home only to be confronted by the gang members who restrain Paul and knock him unconscious with the crowbar. Rosario attempts to call the police but is struck on the head and killed before the assailants escape with Carol, dragging her into their van. The men take Carol to their hideout and deliberate on what to do with her. One suggests killing her since she has seen their faces. Jiver expresses concern because Paul also saw him, but Cutter reassures him that white people tend to think they all look alike. One of the men seizes an opportunity and begins to undress an unresponsive Carol. Back at Paul's house, he is awakened when Jerry returns and rings the doorbell. They discover Rosario's lifeless body. One man finishes his assault on Carol, and as another prepares to take his turn, she suddenly makes a run for it, prompting the men to pursue her. In her escape, she jumps through a window and becomes impaled on the metal bars outside. Meanwhile, the police arrive to remove Rosario's body, and Inspector Mankiewicz comes to gather more information about the assailants. Paul inquires about Carol's whereabouts, but the police have no updates. He attempts to recount the sequence of events but realizes he was knocked unconscious before he could identify any of the attackers. The inspector, aware of Paul's tragic loss of his family back in New York, assures him that he is doing everything possible to assist. At that moment, a police officer informs Paul that they have located his daughter, leading him to the morgue to identify her remains. With his entire family now gone, Paul struggles with insomnia. The funeral service for Carol takes place shortly thereafter, and Paul watches as his daughter is laid to rest. His supervisor encourages him to take some time off, but Paul insists he will return soon. Seeking solace, he retreats to a cabin in the woods where he spends his days chopping firewood as a means of coping with his stress. After several weeks, Paul returns home and resumes work on a new building project for the radio station where Jerry is employed. During a meeting with the station's owner, he encounters Jerry, who inquires about going on a date. However, Paul is not in the right frame of mind. Later, he is approached by police officers asking him to review some mugshots, but Paul claims he does not recall any details. He then retrieves his firearm from its concealed location, loads it, and departs. As Paul strolls through the city, he scrutinizes every suspicious character in hopes of identifying his daughter's killers. That evening, he changes into dark clothing and ventures deep into the inner city, renting a motel room under the alias Mr. Kimball to establish a base of operations. While lurking that night, he sees no sign of the criminals. The following morning, he is startled awake by Jerry, who has entered his home unannounced. Quickly hiding his gun before she notices it, Paul waits for her to leave before calling a locksmith to change his locks. The next night, he decides to patrol the area. While sitting by the roadside, he spots one of the men who had stolen his wallet, known as Stomper. Observing them meet with other individuals, Paul begins to follow closely. The group enters an abandoned building, prompting Paul to don gloves and prepare for action. Paul enters the dilapidated building, which is infested with rats, with his firearm drawn, and encounters a group of men engaged in a transaction. In a sudden turn of events, he shoots one man dead, instructing the others to leave while ordering Stomper to remain where he is. With a smirk, Paul notices Stomper's cross necklace and ominously tells him that he will soon meet Jesus before fatally shooting him. Afterward, Paul returns to his motel room, where he securely hides his firearm. He then heads home just as Jerry calls, expressing concern over his lack of response. Paul explains that he has been home all night but chose not to answer the phone due to telemarketing calls. They proceed to make plans for a date on Friday. Shortly thereafter, news breaks regarding Stomper's death. The following evening, Paul retrieves his gun from the motel room, preparing for another night of vigilantism. While walking through the city, he hears screams emanating from an underground parking lot. Upon investigation, he discovers a group of assailants harassing a couple, with one man forcibly pulling the woman into a van. Paul intervenes, shooting the first two assailants dead. The last assailant turns out to be Jiver, who holds the nearly naked woman at gunpoint and warns Paul to stay back. As Jiver attempts to flee, Paul successfully shoots him in the leg before he can get away. Following the blood trail left by Jiver, Paul tracks him to an abandoned building. Armed and cautious, he searches for the injured criminal, who is lying in wait with his own gun ready. Jiver creates a distraction to draw Paul closer before attempting to run him over with a forklift. Paul evades the attack and ultimately shoots Jiver dead just before the police arrive on the scene. Inspector Mankiewicz expresses frustration towards the husband of the couple for refusing to provide a description of the vigilante and orders his officers to detain him. He then seeks information from the wife, but the husband insists that Paul is simply a good citizen. The inspector subsequently meets with the police commissioner to discuss the possibility of a vigilante operating in the area but doubts his ability to track him down. The commissioner recalls reports of a similar vigilante in New York and instructs the detective to reach out to that department. The NYPD receives this information, and Detective Ochoa notes that Paul now resides in Los Angeles, where these recent reports are originating. Ochoa reveals that he has been monitoring Paul over the years and suspects that he is indeed the vigilante in question. The individuals are concerned that if Paul is apprehended, it will be disclosed that they allowed him to escape, jeopardizing their employment. They intend to capture Paul before the LAPD can intervene and have dispatched Ochoa to investigate him and potentially halt his activities if he is indeed the vigilante. Ochoa arrives in Los Angeles and meets with a contact who informs him of the tragic deaths of Paul's housekeeper and daughter. He subsequently locates Jerry and enters her apartment. Ochoa informs Jerry about Paul's history in New York, detailing how he killed 9 individuals while acting as a vigilante. He explains that Paul was regarded as a hero and encouraged to leave the city, but he suspects that Paul has resumed his vigilante activities. Ochoa believes that Jerry might be able to persuade Paul to cease his actions and leaves her with numerous unanswered questions. When Jerry visits Paul, she encounters him returning from an outing with a male friend. She shares details about her meeting with Ochoa and the allegations made against Paul, but he denies any wrongdoing, asserting that if he were guilty, he would have been arrested. Jerry considers this, recalling that Ochoa had seemed somewhat peculiar. Paul then fabricates an elaborate story regarding the events in New York, sealing it with a kiss that Jerry readily accepts. The next day, Ochoa contacts an associate, requesting that he park his car outside Paul's residence. Paul notices the vehicle but exits through a back entrance, unaware that Ochoa is tailing him. Ochoa follows Paul back to the inner city and observes him entering a motel. After changing clothes and arming himself with 2 pistols, Paul heads back out into the city. While there, He spots Cutter and two other thugs from a previous encounter, although they do not recognize him. Maintaining a close watch on them, he follows as they board a public bus, with Ochoa closely trailing behind. On the bus, the men begin to harass a female passenger, but Paul keeps his distance and remains composed. Eventually, the men disembark from the bus, and Paul follows shortly after as they move into a dimly lit area. Ochoa instructs his taxi driver to wait for him and continues to pursue Paul on foot. Paul, with his firearm drawn, encounters a group of men engaged in a transaction with other criminals for firearms. Meanwhile, Ochoa, who is also observing the situation, spots a sniper positioned in a tree, preparing to take aim at Paul. Just in time, Ochoa alerts Paul, allowing him to evade the attack. However, the gangsters become aware of their presence. Ochoa neutralizes the sniper before he and Paul confront the gangsters in a shootout. Regrettably, Ochoa is struck by gunfire during the exchange. Paul successfully eliminates Cutter and the two accomplices, subsequently shooting the arms dealer, which results in the dealer's vehicle careening off a cliff to his demise. The assailant who shot Ochoa manages to flee the scene. Approaching Ochoa, Paul expresses surprise at his presence there to assist. Ochoa urges Paul to seek vengeance before succumbing to his injuries. Paul then departs the scene just before law enforcement arrives en masse to discover the bodies. One thug remains clinging to life, and Mankiewicz demands to know the identity of Ochoa's killer. The thug reveals the name Charles Wilson before also passing away. The following day, Paul visits Jerry's radio station and learns that the police are planning a significant operation to apprehend Charles. He acquires an old police scanner from one of Jerry's colleagues and attentively monitors it until he overhears preparations for the upcoming operation. Paul drives to the location and observes the officers gearing up for the raid as Charles enters a building. After parking behind the building, Paul ascends to the roof and gains entry to the structure where Charles is located. He readies his weapon, prepared to confront him. Charles, under the influence of drugs, slashes Paul's arm and manages to escape, and a serious confrontation ensues with policemen. Back at his motel, Paul tends to his wound, changes his attire, and then heads home. Jerry returns shortly thereafter, presenting Paul with a newspaper that reports on Ochoa's death and the apprehension of his killer. He then departs to prepare for their upcoming date. During the trial of Charles, the judge rules him criminally insane and orders his commitment to a mental health facility. It is revealed that Jerry is writing an article about the doctor treating Charles, prompting Paul to inquire if he could accompany her for the interview. While at the facility, Paul requests to use the restroom but inadvertently enters the doctor's locker room, where he discovers a coat with an ID badge attached. Seizing the opportunity, he takes the ID and successfully forges a fake one for himself. He later takes Jerry on a date, during which he proposes marriage, and she accepts. Following their engagement, Paul plans a vacation with her after the wedding, which excites Jerry. The next evening, Paul prepares to execute his plan. He drives to the hospital, disguises himself as a doctor, and obtains directions to Charles's room. Paul persuades an orderly to grant him access and leads him to Charles's room. Once inside, the orderly retrieves Charles and leaves him alone with Paul. Paul draws his weapon, but Charles manages to disarm him, leading to a physical altercation, where Paul ultimately electrocutes him. Afterward, Paul encounters the orderly, who recognizes him from reports related to Carol's murder. The orderly grants Paul a 3-minute head start before activating the alarm. Paul hastily escapes back to his motel room to tend to his injuries. Meanwhile, Jerry arrives at his apartment and discovers the fake doctor's ID, along with news of Charles's death. She removes her engagement ring and decides to leave Paul, who returns home moments later. Months later, Paul attends a presentation for his building design at the radio station. The owner invites him to a launch party but questions why Paul is often unavailable in the evenings and does not return phone calls. When Paul accepts the invitation, he responds, "What else would I be doing?" He then resumes his activities on the streets at night, continuing his killing spree. Thanks for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more of these recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.